probably because he's musical and is an accomplished cantor. But he has written fairly extensively on both the biblical and the liturgical implications of what we've been pursuing and its evidence in the texts. To arrive at how I came to this interest, I need to get a little bit autobiographical, so I hope you don't mind if I spend some minutes touching on my, as it were, my scholarly journey. A little bit of autobiography. As noted, I did my doctorate on Dionysius Areopagitis. And I had a horrible time trying to figure him out. So difficult did I find this ancient writer. That is, so difficult to put him together, to view him as a whole, to understand his purposes in writing as he did, that it even led to a kind of crisis of faith about 2 or 3 years in. Because you see, I was faced with the following problems. One, the writer was clearly not the Dionysius the Areopagite mentioned in the book of Acts, chapter 19, at St. Paul's rather unsuccessful missionary venture on the Areopagus. He's clearly a turn of the 6th century writer. So you have a pseudonym. But he was received with immense enthusiasm virtually from the first appearance of his writings. He's commented by a Palestinian bishop, John of Scythopolis, within 20 years or so of the writing's apparition. He's translated into Syriac within a decade or two. And everywhere he goes in the Christian East, which is where he first appears, whether in Greek-speaking circles, in Syriac-speaking circles, whether in the Imperial Church of Constantinople, that is the Chalcedonian, whether in non-Chalcedonian circles, whether in so-called Nestorian circles in what's now Iran and Iraq, and then in the Persian Empire. They all think he's the cat's pajamas, or cat's whiskers, as I think they say in England. And when he's translated into Latin by John Scotus Eriugena, he becomes an immediate and immense hit there. So we have the problem of an ostensible fraud, that is, someone writing under a false name, accepted as having apostolic authority or near apostolic authority. Second, there were the works themselves, which betrayed, as a number of Germans pointed out at the turn of the 20th century, 2 in particular, displayed a detailed knowledge of the next to the last of the great Neoplatonist pagan philosophers, Proclus to Atticus. He even quotes him, in effect, especially in the passage on evil in the Divine Names, chapter 4. And given, as many scholars have thought over the past century, because he's Neoplatonist, that must mean he's not really Christian. He's a kind of philosophical wolf in Christian sheep's clothing. That was pretty much the consensus, actually. There were exceptions, like Hans von Balthasar, like Vladimir Orlowski. But that was pretty much the consensus when I started working. And I fully embraced it. Father John Meyendorff was inclined to that, in that direction as well. And I knew him and loved him well when I was his student. So the problem was this: how could the church, the tradition, have embraced a fraud who was, moreover, not really Christian, or not as fully Christian as one would hope? Then finally, thirdly, there was what appeared to be an incoherence in the writings themselves. On the one hand, the advocacy, it seemed, in the little treatise Mystical Theology and at different places in the Divine Names, of an immediate encounter with God. And on the other hand, the two treatises on the hierarchies, the celestial and ecclesiastical, which insisted on mediated knowledge, kind of percolates down from above, from seraphim to cherubim to thrones, dominions, principalities, powers, down the angelic ranks to the bishops, to the priests, to the deacons, and to the faithful. How did that work? And I broke my head over it. Moreover, increasingly troubled by the thought, how could this thing have been received? Fraudulent, incoherent, and not really Christian. And that led to the crise de foi. So at a certain point, I despaired, told then Father Callistos that I wanted to go to Greece to see if I could find a holy man. I figured there had to be one on Mount Athos somewhere. If there were holy men, that'd be the place to look. He agreed, since he wasn't getting a dissertation at that point. And I wangled a scholarship thanks to the good offices of the then Archbishop of Thyatira in Great Britain, Athenagoras, and went and made the acquaintance of the monastery of Simonos Petros in my first year in Greece, and was at the end of that year invited by its abbot to spend a year there and complete my dissertation. I wasn't so sure about the last, but I thought the first was probably a good idea. And in fact, it turned out to be life-changing. Because the monastery of this man, Emilianos, and the man himself, who was revealed through the structures he insisted on in his monastery, were in fact my key to this ancient writer. And I can go into some details about how, but I think that would take us down another path, so I shan't. I've written about it, so look it up. But the long and the short of it is that liturgy, the inner life, and the appearance of God, theophany, both within the heart and on the altar. And the coordination of those two were my keys to making sense of both the hierarchies, which word, by the way, Dionysius appears to have been the inventor of, and by which I take it he means essentially liturgy, structured worship. And that was the beginning of what would result ultimately in the Theophany school, but there are a couple of moments along the way in addition that I should touch on. When I defended the dissertation in 1980, my two examiners were the super distinguished Henry Chadwick of blessed memory, who terrified me because of his distinction, and this very sweet professor of Syriac studies, Sebastian Brock, whom I knew merely from acquaintance at the Orthodox Church in Oxford and at the meetings of St. Sergius and Alban, and who seemed to me so kindly and mild that I wanted him as one of my examiners. As it turned out, he asked the most probing questions, and I had no idea at the time of his remarkable eminence in Syriac studies. He called me into his office the day after the defense to present me with an icon he had sent away of Dionysius. And as he handed it to me, he remarked almost offhandedly, "You know, your treatment of Dionysius on the names rather reminded me of Saint Ephrem, although in a completely different idiom." At the time, it seemed like a nice thing to say, and as I had no idea of Ephrem, I knew of him, but not what he'd written, or what Sebastian had written. So I filed it away and happily went away with my icon and my degree. When, however, I arrived at Marquette University some years later, this is the early 90s, I remembered that remark, and as it happened, at that very time, St. Vladimir's Press published Sebastian's translation and introduction to St. Ephrem's chef-d'oeuvre, in some respects, his Hymns on Paradise. And I was, as the French say, bouleversé. Because in his introduction, I think it's page 44, 45 of the St. Vladimir's edition, he lays out the schema, if it were, of the Paradise hymns and the parallels at work in Ephrem's thinking. It's a kind of table. And in one column, you had the events of Sinai, the peak of the mountain where God appears, paralleled by the Holy of Holies of the temple, paralleled by the altar of the Christian church, paralleled by the deepest part of the Christian soul. Then next down, the temple veil, and then next down, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, paralleled by the temple veil, paralleled by the veil which in fact existed in Christian churches in Syria at the time between the sanctuary and the nave. and on down. But what stunned me was this was my thesis on Dionysius. I thought he was original. He was kind of harmonizing, as it were, the legacy of Evagrius' take on the ascetical tradition and the liturgy, harmonizing the inner and the outer, making them part of the same thing, the same ascent. But I found this was there in Ephraim. Moreover, there was Sebastian's detailed account of the Jewish traditions, the Jewish reading of, say, Genesis 1, Sinai, and Sinai. That those observations of Sebastian are then ignited my interest in the Jewish sources. Now, in that case, it played into a long-term interest of mine, and in fact, something which the Theophany school was designed to address. And that is the immense lacuna, if you were, in the great figures, the great Orthodox writers of the 20th century, of what Father George Florovsky called the neo-patristic synthesis. They were wonderful in their expanded, as it were, canon. But there was something missing. And that was precisely the Old Testament. As my own instructor in Old Testament in seminary remarked, he said, and Father George, whom he greatly reminded, knows New Testament criticism backwards and forwards. He's alive to every present concern and interest. But regarding the Old Testament, well, he knows what a well-informed seminarian of Odessa in 1905 would know. Or likewise, Vladimir Losky in his wonderful little book, The Vision of God, which is a wonderful little book. But in that little book, I think he has 1 or 2 sentences on the Old Testament. And I had long felt the contrary from my very first introduction to it in academic circles, that there was something to this that was reflected more deeply in our ancient literature, in our liturgy, than was talked about. For example, now we move to the Theophanies. There are several appearances of God, yes, in the Old Testament. Most notably, of course, Sinai. It's the Theophany, if you will, for biblical Israel. The appearance of God on the mountain. But beginning even in the Genesis story of Adam and Eve, God walks in the garden. He speaks directly to Adam and Eve. He appears to the prophet Isaiah in the temple, to the prophet Ezekiel by the banks of the river Kabar in exile in Babylon. It's suggested, at least in Habakkuk, the Lord between the living creatures. In Judges, the figures that appear to Manoah and in Joshua, to Joshua, the commander, the so-called angel of the Lord is almost certainly a divine appearance. And in several of these instances, most notably in the vision of Ezekiel and in that of Isaiah, it's an enthroned figure, human-like figure, that's specified in Ezekiel, as it were the appearance of the likeness of a human being. And likewise in Exodus, the figure whom Moses and the elders see in chapter 24. They're invited up the mountain to have, as it were, brunch with God. And they saw the God of Israel and ate and drank. The Septuagint kind of seeks perhaps to ameliorate the stark anthropomorphism of the Hebrew by amending that passage slightly to read, and they saw the place where the God of Israel stood and ate and drank. But in each of these cases, an anthropomorphic presence is clear. Elsewhere in Exodus, the form of divine appearance is as a burning fire. And in this case, an important word is deployed, which appears with some frequency in Exodus in this context, appears in the Psalms likewise, often, and in Ezekiel. And that word is glory, the glory of the Lord. And it seemed to me, even as a seminarian, that this had to have something to do with all that stuff about transfiguration and delight and whatnot that you find, say, in St. Gregory Palamas. But nobody was connecting those dots. Why not? At that point, I was introduced, at this point in my evolution and at the university, at Marquette, I was introduced to Gershom Scholem. Scholem was a noted Jewish scholar who wrote his seminal work, The Major Trends of Jewish Mysticism, in the early 1940s. He was a German Jew who had, I think, by that point, escaped to Mandate Palestine. And Scholem's question didn't immediately bear on Christian sources, but it did tangentially have, I thought, some impact. His question was the following. In the origins of Kabbalah, which he detailed in a great work that demonstrated the authorship and place of the chief work of the Zohar, of the Kabbalistic tradition, the Zohar, in 13th century Spain, he noticed things which were reminiscent of the apocalypses written in the from 2nd century BC to 2nd century AD. But that was 1,000 years or more before the Zohar. What were there elements in Jewish tradition which carried on these, as it were, mystical hints In the Apocalypses, the vision of the heavenly court, the vision of the figure on the throne, as in Daniel, for example, Daniel 7, the Ancient of Days, or as in the Revelation of John, chapters 4 and 5 following. And he thought he found these. He thought he found the continuum in a set of medieval texts, which he argued were much, much older, that were interested in the ascent through the heavens, to the divine throne, or as the Jewish writers called it, the Merkava, the chariot, in reference to Ezekiel's vision. And here was the key for me. At the end of this chapter, which is the second in the book, where he lays out his thesis concerning these ancient Jewish documents, he mentions at the very end the Macarian homilies. Those of you familiar with Macarius, with that remarkable set of writings, will know that the first homily in the popular collection of 50 begins with an extensive paraphrase of Ezekiel's vision in Ezekiel 1, wherein the writer says, now Ezekiel really saw what he saw. It's true. God truly appeared. But there's something even more wonderful going on here, because what appears to Ezekiel is an image of the Christian soul, which is intended to become the chariot throne of God. And Scholem offhandedly notes, well, here's clearly an interiorization of the Merkava tradition. But I thought, oh my God, well, that's the lot. Here's our theology of deification. Not the product of some Platonist influence, although the word itself might be. I think Clement of Alexandria coins it. But the idea is there in the Hebrew texts, is part of the, as it were, the warp and woof, the fabric of the origin of of Christianity from the very start. In fact, as I continued then to look, and with the help of my graduate students who were becoming increasingly, from the late 90s on, increasingly intrigued with this notion, especially the Orthodox ones. As Father Bogdan, your next speaker, remarked to me once, you know, for us, this is just too easy. It's so obvious. It leaps out at you in the text. And as I would be pointing out along the same lines, in a wonderful subsection of the Society of Biblical Literature meetings called the Jewish and Early Christian Mysticism section, where a lot of both Christian and Jewish scholars came together to hash out, as it were, Scholem's idea, which, by the way, had received extraordinary confirmation in the publication of the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's a work among those, the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, which are almost a perfect illustration of Scholem's whole thesis. That interest in the Merkava, the chariot throne of God, was alive and well in Qumran in the century or two immediately before Christ. And moreover, this apparently was understood as a possible experience, perhaps collectively, the community as a whole, but nonetheless emphasized. In fact, as we began to pull back and look at the whole thing, that is Christian, the Orthodox Christian tradition, Christianity itself, we saw these themes, these emphases, the importance of the Theophanies, as it were, and the concomitants, Sinai and Temple, woven into the whole tradition from the start. Think of the question, how did those Galilean peasants in the 1st century AD come up with the notion of Trinity? Well, they didn't come up with a word. That would have been strange to them. Or homoousios or any of that. But they draw the picture in Peter's speech in Acts. How do they come up with deification? Well, you find it's there implicit in the text of the revelation to Israel itself, starting with the image and likeness of Genesis 1:26. It is all part of the same, it is all part of one whole, the revelation to Israel, of which our Lord Jesus is the completion. And as Jewish scholars have noted, I can think of a couple of them right offhand, the notion of incarnation is not foreign to the revelation to Israel. The cross is something new. The scandal, as St. Paul says. But the notion of incarnation, that's there. As is the notion of sharing in the divine life. So we set out to explore this and have been doing so ever since. I've gone on for 40 minutes or so, I think, which is probably just about as long as I want to go. You might want to address questions to me. That's all. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. Time for questions from the audience. Thank you very much, Your Eminence, for this sharing your personal journey so powerfully. Thank you.
Any questions?
Yes, I have a question. You have mentioned that at the very beginning of your Christian journey, you had, so to say, crisis of faith because you realized that what Dionysius is writing goes a little bit against Christian tradition. So could you formulate once again, how did you, why you believed Dionysius was against Christian tradition? You spoke about this, but could you just formulate briefly?
I was following the scholarly consensus at the time, like many of us do.
Mm-hmm.
I was wrong. They were wrong.
Right, but
John
theologically,
Maynard spoke very often in his, for example, when he's addressing Saint Maximus, or when he's addressing particularly Gregory Palamas, and the debate with Barlaam over Dionysius. I think from Father John's perspective, Barlaam was right in his interpretation, but wrong, of course, doctrinally. And that St. Gregory was applying what Father John liked to refer to as a Crystological corrective to Dionysius. That is, he isn't sufficiently Christian. Well, we'll just kind of tweak him so that he is. I came to see that, in fact, St. Gregory was the better interpreter of Dionysius, and Barlaam the false one. For example, let's take their respective relationships, Barlaam and Parlamus, to another ancient Christian writer. In Barlaam's case, the relationship is debatable, but it is clear that Gregory had read Maximus Planudes' translation of Augustine's De Trinitate. It was the first one of Augustine's works translated into Greek in 1286, I think. And a German scholar a few years ago demonstrated that Gregory in his theological chapters quotes without attribution, but quotes the De Trinitate and the flow of love within the Trinity. And clearly he quite likes it. What he does not quote are the opening chapters of the De Trinitate, which have to do with the Old Testament Theophanies. Now, Augustine was faced with a Trinitarian problem in North Africa. There were Homoians around who argued from the very traditional understanding of the Old Testament Theophanies as the appearance of the second person, and that is virtually univocal in the pre-Nicene literature. The one who appears to Moses and the prophets is the second person of the Trinity. Or as are expressed, and Father Bogdan's written an article on this, as expressed so beautifully in one of our Lenten hymns, in fact, the hymn of Cassiani, sung on Holy Tuesday Matins. The sinful woman who seizes Christ's feet and bathes them with her tears, she is bathing with her tears those same feet, writes Cassiani, from whose steps Eve fled in paradise. That is, the one who walked in paradise is the second person. Yes. And this occurs over and over and over again in the liturgical tradition. Think of the Holy Week hymns. He who sits upon the foal of the ass is the same as he who sits upon the cherubim, and so on. So, in contrast, Barlaam has, and so the Homoians argued that because the second person is visible, that means he can't be God, because God is by definition invisible. And Augustine's solution is to say, well, the Theophanies aren't Theophanies. They are mere appearances, perhaps of an angel, perhaps simply of matter configured for the occasion and then dropped. Kind of special effects, as it were, put on by heaven for the impressment of us. So they have no significance. And Gregory is, no, this It's God who appears via his energies, which is in fact the solution that we begin to see sketched in the 4th century, but that will take me down another path, and I won't go there. So likewise, in parallel, then Dionysius Palamas reads Dionysius correctly, because this is in Dionysius as well. In the divine names, he more or less spells it out. He says, all these are names for God who has appeared, and that's essentially the second person. So, I had to be persuaded and to see that Dionysius was, in fact, fully in sync with the tradition. And now back to Sebastian and Ephraim's coordination of heaven, the liturgy, and the heart. I found that was already there, not only in Ephraim, but again in the Macarian homilies, in a Syriac work called the Liber Graduum. That is the basis of Dionysius' hierarch, combination of liturgy and mysticism, the inner life, and his incorporation of liturgy into the inner life, was something already present in the Syrian tradition. He was part of a continuum that is then further accentuated by Maximus Confessor in his wonderful little piece, The Mystagogy. And remains in especially ascetical literature down through the Byzantine era. Read Gregory of Sinai on the soul hierarchically, as bishop, celebrating celebrating the divine presence at the altar of the soul in the darkness of the divine presence, which is light. Well, sorry, is that an answer to your question?
Almost, but just
Almost,
one
okay.
more clarification, because you, in the very beginning, you mentioned that when your initial question was how could St. Dionysius be accepted by the church, and you mentioned that the problem was that he insisted on the mediated knowledge, and that was a main issue for you. So how
That's
this
how
problem was resolved? Could you just comment on that?
That's how the hierarchies were read, as it were, kind of standing between us and God. Yes? It's not how they're to be understood.
Okay.
If hierarchy is liturgy, yes, and that's my take, it is not mediation in the sense of we don't have direct access. It's first of all the liturgy itself, which is apocalypse, that is, revelation of the divine presence. And secondly, insofar as the angels communicate knowledge, then you have exactly, I think, a parallel. And in fact, this is made not by Dionysius, but over 100 years before him, by Palladius of Heliopolis, a disciple of Evagrius, who writes the Lausiac history. He says, everyone has a teacher except God. And the first rank of angels, who are taught directly by God, and then teach those below them who teach those below them. So it's teaching, but a very specific kind of teaching. Teaching is explanation of what one sees, of what one encounters. in the sense of the figure of the Angelus Interpres of the ancient apocalypses. Remember, there's a figure who explains to Daniel what he's seeing. And likewise in the Revelation of John. And so the elder in ascetical literature isn't the one who produces the experience of God in the disciple, but the one who points out whether or not it's genuine, who explains to the disciple what the disciple has seen. So it's mediation in that sense, as Gregory Palamas points this out. He says, it doesn't produce the vision, it is the mises, the initiation, the explanation, the clarification of the vision. In fact, Dionysius more or less expresses this directly in a couple of points, for example, with regard to the Mother of God and the Annunciation. So what I had to overcome, as it were, was the scholarly consensus at the time of my studies. It led me astray. It was wrong. And I had to find out these other ways, how wrong it was, and adjust accordingly. Johannes, you were looking thoughtful?
Yes, I'm very thoughtful and very grateful to both of you. Also, Olga, making you specify this, because these the latest lines gave me a lot. I was thinking, I have a more general question. I read that the reception of the Epiphania school has been, in many Orthodox circles, a little bit disinterested.
Yep.
Yes, and I although I find it your thesis most convincing, also thanks to Stephen de Young's later book, Religion of the Apostles, that popularized these theses very effectively lately. But I would like to ask you, what do you think is at stake? What do we win, or by reclaiming this heritage that the first Christians were so aware of and obviously utilizing, building on, that, but we have kind of lost touch with? What do we win, and what do we lose if we do not reclaim this heritage?
Well, first of all, I think we win the scripture. We have something to say to scripture studies. I think the Orthodox have been, for a couple of centuries, in part intimidated by that wonderful German learning. They're, after all, the originators of biblical criticism, of patristics, as we understand it. And they've done enormously useful work. All those dictionaries, even now you can consult even an Adolf von Harnack with Prophet, because he read everything. I think he was out to lunch in his opinions of the patristic tradition, but he read everything. And you can find things in him which, well, him, von Reitzenstein, others, that I've made articles out of. They don't see it, but I saw it because they had the details. So wonderfully useful. But in biblical studies, you have this immense structure, this establishment. And the Orthodox, I think, are a little timid about venturing in, or if they become part of that establishment, they do indeed become part of it. They aren't paying enough attention then to the tradition, as embodied not simply in dogmatic pronouncements, but in the liturgy, in the ascetical and mystical tradition. Father Emilianos, for example, is rich in allusions and citations to exactly those revelatory chapters of Exodus that I stressed just now. And temple. In fact, these occur throughout the ascetical literature. The monks found them revealing and it's significant. In ways modern Orthodox maybe aren't sufficiently aware of. So we recover that. We recover our scripture. It is our scripture. That it is one revelation.
Yes.
There isn't an Old Testament and a New Testament properly. There is scripture and the divine presence, the presence of Christ, the second person. As Origen pointed out so many years ago, so many centuries ago. But he was right. His hidden meaning is always Christ.
Yes.
And here, and this is especially perhaps the case here in America, where, you know, the predominant form of Christianity is Protestant, often biblically very literalist. So I certainly had in mind, in an American university, addressing the larger American public with this essentially scriptural message. So that'll have to do for now. Oh, and finally, you know, what gets us Orthodox, what gets our juices flowing aren't innovations, but continuities. And boy, there's a real continuity here.
Yes. That is, thank you very much. That's a very, very inspiring answer. And it's about empowering us in sense.
Yes.
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 So is that my hour?
Yes, Olga, you have the whole picture now.
Mm-hmm.
I think, yeah, it's we have many participants. Maybe somebody wants to ask something because they believe they are muted, but actually they can ask the question. They just unmute. You have a green button and unmute yourself. If you have urgent question, please ask now. Otherwise, we will have discussion at the end, and we can discuss issues later. But yeah, somebody, the Metropolitan of
yes, but thank you very much. But now there is no time. It's the time for the next lecture.
Always time for you. Always time for you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Your Eminence. I think we have to remember that because of the problems of as you know better than me, of the monotheistic problems, they rejected this text in the Ecumenical Council of Ephesus. But later, St. Maximus, he brought them back. And today, these texts are very influential to all of us when we're talking about καταφατική and αποφατική. Apophatic and cataphatic theology, and it helps us when we have the problem of the climate change, how to make this distinction between creator and creation. But for me, as the theme of the conference is about the revelation of God to the modern world, now we have to respect, of course, the tradition of Saint Dionysius, not only of the text of the 5th century, but also to go to this tradition, because it's not by accident that this Syria author tried to use the name of Saint Dionysius, who is a historical person, as you know, all of you. So today, we are talking, all of us, about the dialogue, the political leaders, church leaders, religious leaders. But unfortunately, some of our leaders, they don't have dialogue between them to solve a problem. And this is the synod. So in which way, for example, the theology of this text of Saint Dionysius can play this important role, and to realize this distinction between creation, and to realize that without the help of the Creator, we cannot do anything as humans. And so in which ways this text can contribute today to have a dialogue between the Orthodox to solve our eternal problems with love and understanding, in order to be able not to protect also only our members, but also the whole humanity, as we claim that Orthodoxy is the historical continuation of the Apostolic Church. Sorry for this, Professor Olga and Professor Johannes, but His Eminence, I know him, he's a very good man, and his wisdom can help us in this way.
Your Eminence. Nice to hear you, by the way. I don't think that Dionysius is any more relevant to our modern intra-Orthodox problems than any of the other church fathers or the ascetic fathers. And I think probably it'll be more profitable to remind our brothers of the ascetics and their lessons, notably humility, closing their mouths and opening their ears, than Dionysius, who requires an ascesis to enter into. A certain putting aside, as I need to do, of assumptions. But the lessons of the ascetic fathers and the Gospels is much more blunt, and I think important to recall to our brethren. Humility, long-suffering, patience, and an open ear. Any other questions? No?
If not at the moment, I want to recommend you all to write down questions during the next session. If you're still thinking about, and I'm sure you are still thinking about what has been said this far, and we have the joy to continue within the same school. So all the questions can be addressed to both our speakers today after the second session. And Olga, if that's okay, I will move on to present the Reverend Dr. Bogdan G. Bucur.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Father Bogdan Bucur was born in Romania, and I'm quoting St. Vladimir's home page on you, Father Bucur, because I found that presentation so good that I wasn't able to read anything better, to write anything better, so I'm quoting from there. He is married to Christina, and they are parents of Irina, Andrei, and Miruna, from ages 6 to 21 years. After studying at the Faculty of Orthodox Theology in Bucharest, Father Bogdan left for the United States, where he earned his Master of Arts in 2002 and PhD 2007 in religious studies at Margaret University under the direction of now Archbishop Alexander Golitzin. Between 2007 and 2020, he was assistant and then associate professor of theology at Duquesne University, yes, in Pittsburgh, where he worked in the areas of early Christian studies and reception history of the Bible. In 2010, he was ordained a priest in the Antiochian Orthodox Archdiocese and served as the pastor of St. Anthony Orthodox Church in Butler. Father Bogdan and his family came to St. Vladimir at the beginning of the fall term 2020. It's a very historical year. Father Bogdan is a scholar of early Christianity with a special interest in the link between reception history of the Bible and doctrinal developments in early Christianity and the Byzantine tradition. He views it as an important to study how early Christians articulated their religious identity by reworking doctrines, imagery, and practices inherited from the many currents of the Second Temple Judaism. His academic interests were shaped significantly by participation in the interdisciplinary seminar on the Jewish roots of Christian mysticism and the Theophany school, both led by Professor Andrei Orlov and Archbishop Dr. Alexander Golitzin at Margaret University. Father Bogdan's first book, Angelomorphic Pneumatology, Clement of Alexandria and Other Christian Witnesses, published in 2009 by Brill, dealt with the use of angelic imagery in early Christian pneumatology. His second book, Scripture Re-Envisioned, Christophanic Exegesis and the Making of the Christian Bible, published in 2018 by Brill, 2019, is the first volume of a projected three-part study of the early Christian interpretation of biblical theophanies. And I think the material for today comes from this book. Am I right? In any case, Father Buckner, it's an honor to have you here. The floor is yours.
Father Bogdan, you just can switch on your camera and microphone.
I would like first of all to thank the organizers for the invitation to give a paper before the Orthodox Research Group of St. John Chrysostom. I'm especially glad and honored to present right after Archbishop Alexander. It is to him that I owe, to his scholarship, to his mentorship, that I owe my understanding of Theophany as being at the heart of the Orthodox theological and spiritual tradition. So in a way, it is entirely Archbishop Alexander's influence that shaped my own interest in the topic that I'm going to present about. My paper is entitled Exegesis, Intertextuality, and the Transformative Gaze.
Father Bogdan, I'm very sorry to interrupt you, but there may be a speaker on in your room that creates an echo. If you could fix that, it would be very helpful. Thank you.
Is Isaiah's vision in a Byzantine illumination. And I'm going to transfer to this image and then scroll through the PowerPoint. The Codex Vatop 760 is a Psalter.
Father Bogdan, I'm very sorry to interrupt you, but I think there you may have a speaker on which creates an echo. And if you could just close the speaker.
It is one of those so-called aristocratic psalters, produced in Constantinople in the 11th or 12th century, containing a series of commemorative notes for the members of the Comnenus family. At some point in the 18th century, It entered the possession of Constantine Mavrocordatos, the learned ruler at several intervals in the 18th century of the Romanian provinces of Wallachia and Moldavia, before ending up on Mount Athos at the Vatopedi monastery, probably because that is where David Comnenus had died as a monk. And let me show you this beautiful image. On the versa of volume 280, this codex contains an image illustrating in a particular, even peculiar way, the prayer of Isaiah. Isaiah 26, verses 9 through 20. That is one of the biblical odes that form the traditional appendage of the Psalter. Anthony Cutler offers the following detailed description of the icon. In the heavens, the white-bearded Lord seated on a golden backless throne. On it, a red cushion covered with a striped white cloth. He has a golden nimbus marked with a red cross and a violet imation over a brown tunic. He carries a staff in his right hand, and with his left hand supports a closed golden book on his knee. Above his head, in red, traces of the sigla for Jesus Christos. A red inscription just below the upper red frame is now illegible. His bare feet rest on a red footstool. The vision is enclosed in a circular aureole of different blues and flanked by a pair of seraphim, their dark blue wings crossed above and below their brown lozenge-shaped faces. Beneath these, a pair of hepsapteriga carrying red staffs in their hands, their feet exposed beneath their red and dark blue wings. On the dark green ground below, an angel hands a burning coal to Isaiah on a spoon. This area is difficult to discern. Between them, in red, from Isaiah 6:7, an excerpt of Isaiah 6:7, which in its totality reads, "Behold, this has touched your lips, and it shall take away your lawlessnesses or your iniquities, and your sins it shall purify." What's actually written is, "It shall take away lawlessnesses, and your sins it shall purify." The near total background, the near total golden background of the icon functions as a sort of divine imprimatur, indicating to the viewers that they are entering a glory-suffused visionary space in which they are to recognize their reality as outsiders called to become insiders. It should be noted, however, that the iconographer is simply exploiting the ekphrastic and mystagogical elements of the biblical source text itself. Indeed, Isaiah 6 opens with a radical statement, "I saw the Lord," which then cascades into the famous vision report that impressed and set aflame so many generations of Jewish and Christian readers, unveiling the pattern of divine worship in imitation of the angelic sanctus, and eventually making possible the extension of this scriptural icon into the aesthetic icon that we have just seen. The description of what the prophet sees in Isaiah 6 corresponds quite transparently to the furnishing of the temple. To the prophetic gaze, the Ark of the Covenant appears as a throne. The invisible divine presence above the mercy seat takes the concrete appearance of an anthropomorphic enthroned king. The two golden cherubim on the mercy seat come alive as seraphim thundering their divine praise, and the temple appears filled with a superabundance and presumably luminous glory. Heaven and earth, the physical reality of Jerusalem and the temple in Jerusalem, and its imaginal reality are simultaneous, coincident realities. And this conjunction and simultaneity only gains in complexity with the depiction of the enthroned figure as Jesus Christ and the purification as a Eucharistic scene. "I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, lofty and raised up," Isaiah's vision report begins. In other words, God adapts himself to human perception. As in other theophanies of the Hebrew Bible, The anthropomorphism is an act of condescension, of adaptation, a declaration of interest in communicating with the human seer, and, considered from a Christian perspective, a first step that announces and prepares for the further step of the incarnation. This is why the icon identifies the anthropomorphic Lord by a cruciform halo, that is, by a halo with an inscribed cross, and by an inscription that removes any and all doubt about his identity, Jesus Christ. There is nothing surprising or unusual in the straightforward identification of the enthroned Lord of Isaiah 6 with the Lord of Christian worship, Jesus Christ. This kind of Christological exegesis of Old Testament theophanies in general, and of Isaiah 6 in particular, has roots in the New Testament writings, flourished in the 2nd and 3rd century polemical engagements against Judaism, against various dualistic and monarchian theologies, later maintained its presence, albeit with diminished relevance, in the 4th and 5th centuries, before becoming once again near ubiquitous and central in Byzantine hymnography, and, as the example under discussion shows, iconography. The Gospel of John identifies the Kyrios of Isaiah's vision with the Kyrios, Jesus Christ. Isaiah saw his glory, writes John at chapter 12:41, just as we have seen his glory in the prologue. There is more to this identification, however, since John 12 fuses the imagery of the enthroned Lord of Sabaoth in Isaiah 6 with that of the suffering servant in Isaiah 53. This Christological interpretation is echoed by prominent writers of the pre-Nicene era, such as Justin Martyr, Irenaeus of Lyon, Tertullian, even the Alexandrians Clement and Origen, whose biblical exegesis is dominated by other concerns, chiefly by other concerns, retain the Christological exegesis of Theophanies and speak occasionally about the Word and the angel of the Lord who came to the patriarchs and Moses, the servant of the prophets, who contemplated the glory of Christ. Note here the reference to Isaiah 6 via John 12. And that even before what Clement called the hidden angel, Jesus, or mystikos ekinos angelos Jesus, before he was born. In later centuries, Cyril of Jerusalem, Eusebius of Caesarea, Jerome, John Chrysostom, Pseudo-Asterius the Sophist, the Apostolic Constitutions, the Pseudo-Macarian Homilies, all identify the enthroned Lord of Isaiah 6 with Christ. A different reading started to spread in the opening decades of the 2nd century. In the martyrdom and ascension of Isaiah, the prophet, pseudo-Isaiah anyway, the prophet gazes upon a triad composed of the glorious one, the Father of the Lord, whose glories it is impossible to behold, and his two attendants, the Lord Jesus and the angel of the Holy Spirit. Obviously, the Father corresponds to the enthroned Lord in Isaiah 6:1, while the angelomorphic Son and Spirit, referred to earlier as the angel of the Logos and the angel of the Holy Spirit, correspond to the two seraphim. Irenaeus, for his part, appropriates this imagery, but applies a significant theological corrective. The two cherubim or seraphim are no longer identified with, but are subordinated to the Son and the Spirit. Generally speaking, in 2nd and 3rd century Alexandria, a subtler allegorical symbolization of Isaiah 6 begins to take hold among Christians. Clement insists on decoding the seraphim allegorically as an image of the perfected soul in ceaseless contemplation and perpetual praise. Origen notes that the seraphim are veiling, or rather completely concealing, the head and feet of the Lord, not their own, but those of the Lord, Origen insists, so as to show that things pertaining to the beginning and to the end are not given to created knowledge. The same is echoed in Jerome, whose commentary on Isaiah is, of course, based on Origen's, and in an exegetical move ascribed to his famous Hebrew master, which would enjoy a rich reception history. Origen also discerns in the three characters of the narrative, the enthroned Lord and the two seraphim, a symbolic image of the Trinity. This he does on first principles, also in his homilies on Isaiah, as well as in his book against Celsus. Following Origen's lead, who says that the seraphim guard the mystery of the Trinity, 4th and 5th century writers such as the Cappadocian, Cyril of Alexandria, Theodoret of Cyrus generally favored the Trinitarian interpretation of Isaiah 6, though the Arian crisis determined an insistent rejection of any trace of subordinationism. The anti-Eunomian polemics, furthermore, brought to the fore a distinct emphasis on the paradox that Isaiah 6 is both an overwhelming visionary experience of God and an experience in which the ultimate reality of God, the substance, is not exhausted and remains inaccessible. Basil of Caesarea, for instance, is at pains to show that even as the prophet was allowed a contemplation of the divine glory, his ousia remained utterly inaccessible. Similarly, St. John Chrysostom explains that the throne vision in Isaiah 6, just like the visions of Jacob, Moses, Ezekiel, and Daniel, is not a vision of the ousia, but a matter of condescension, of considerateness, synkatavasis. So condescension towards human limitation and weakness. All these were instances of his condescension, he writes, not the vision of the essence itself unveiled. The shift from the Crystological to the Trinitarian interpretation of Isaiah 6 can also be observed in hymnography. But here the change does not seem to have happened before the 9th century, with the hymns of the Sunday midnight office, composed by Metrophanes of Smyrna. The older and by far the dominant voice is that of Romanos the melodist, and of many festal hymns, which insist on the paradoxical identification of the lofty Lord seated in full glory on his throne with the humble preacher from Galilee, riding sideways on his donkey. It is clear that the visual exegesis of Isaiah 6 in the Codex Vatopediu 760 preserves and continues alongside all other illuminated manuscripts, and in conjunction with the older hymnography, the original Christophanic understanding of the text. Just as the Christological re-envisioning of Isaiah 6:1 is in no way unusual, as I said, in early Christianity, so also is the depiction of a white-haired Jesus, profoundly traditional. At the very top of the illumination, a second inscription, which is indeed barely legible, but still we can see something, leaves the viewer in no doubt that the enthroned figure is Jesus Christ, who is also the Ancient of Days, because that's what it says there, O Paleos ton imeron. This is a detail borrowed from Daniel's vision of the Ancient of Days, an expression of the exegetical identification of Christ as both the Son of Man and the Ancient of Days, in line with the vision of the risen Christ in Revelation 1. Revelation 1, verses 13 and 14, refers to the exalted Jesus as Son of Man, but depicts him in terms that correspond to the appearance of the Ancient of Days, specifically the white hair. The reception history of this text shows that the polymorphic Christology governing the interpretation of the Ancient of Days and Son of Man as two complementary aspects of the same Christ does not represent a mere strand of some primitive Christian exegesis, but occupies rather the broad mainstream of early Christian and later Byzantine biblical exegesis, and offers a highly interesting Christian counterpart to the exegetical efforts in rabbinic tradition of suppressing the view attributed to the nations and to a certain whoreson, so definitely to Christians, that Daniel's visions and Daniel's vision of the Son of Man and Ancient of Days gives license to affirm two powers in heaven. What I mean is that it is precisely the oneness of the Lord that is expressed visually by the icon. There's one Lord, white-haired like the Ancient of Days, but definitely the Son of Man. And it offers, this depiction offers a fitting counterpart to a beautiful hymn by Romanos the melodist, which states the following: "Let us all raise our eyes to God in heaven as we cry like Jeremiah, the one who appeared on earth, this is our God, who also willingly lived among men and underwent no change, who showed himself in different shapes to the prophets, the one whom Ezekiel contemplated like the form of a man on the fiery chariot, and Daniel as the Son of Man and Ancient of Days." Notice, Son of Man and Ancient of Days, proclaiming the ancient and the young to be one Lord, the one who appeared and enlightened all things. So then, according to Romanos, as well as to our icon, Daniel 7 proclaims, Isaiah and Daniel proclaim one Lord, specifically the one who would be incarnate, Jesus Christ, simultaneously young and old, Son of Man and Ancient of Days. And the point I made earlier about how this is rather coming to affirm something like what the rabbis are trying to affirm, I think is warranted. That is, they're both denying any kind of two-ness. The difference is that Christians name and identify this one Lord as Christ. The anthropomorphism of God as a white-haired king seated on his lofty throne, very similar to the white-haired anthropos summoned before the throne. Let's go back to the image. In fact, let me pause for a moment and to say that we do have texts and we do have icons that depict Christ as the Ancient of Days. Of course, the Son of Man is not problematic, but the Ancient of Days might be something that we perhaps need to relearn. This one here on the right is the one of the oldest that we have, and it is inscribed as Jesus Christ, Emmanuel, the Ancient of Days. To the left, a very, very rich manuscript and a wonderful illumination produced in Constantinople, exquisite, with the same inscription, Jesus Christ, the Ancient of Days. In a fresco, which is definitely not that exquisite, you can see that they even misspell Paleos, just spelling it the way they heard it. This shows you that in cities, in villages, in poor communities, the same theology was expressed visually. And this is from 16th century Romania. The same depiction of Jesus Christ as the Ancient of Days in various locations around Suceava, Sucevița Monastery. Well, the point is, this is not unusual. And with this, then we're back to our icon with the white-haired Jesus. And I was saying that the white-haired Jesus and the white-haired prophet share something, a certain similarity of traits, because the Lord whom Isaiah saw is also Isaiah's heavenly prototype. More specifically, for the religious tradition that finds expression in the manuscript, in this manuscript illumination, Christ as the eternal Logos is the image of God, and as Logos incarnaturus, Logos to be incarnate, Word to be made man, also the paradigm of the human being. Again, this is true of the broad mainstream of early Christian and later Byzantine biblical exegesis. The six-winged seraphim are, of course, what Isaiah mentions in verse 2. The seraphim had 6 wings, and with 2 they cover their faces, and with 2 they cover their feet, and with 2 they flew. Isaiah very clearly speaks of 2 seraphim. Transparently, the 2 golden cherubim that have come alive. And they cry to each other, Eteros proston eteron, holy, holy, holy is the Lord Sabaoth, the whole earth is full of his glory. The icon, however, has 4 heavenly creatures that surround the throne. Aside from the two seraphim, there are two other creatures, which, judging by their appearance, they are full of eyes. As you can see, these two in the front must be Ezekiel's cherubim from Ezekiel 10. It seems then that the two seraphim do double duty. They are not only the visual correspondent to Isaiah 6, but also join the two cherubim so that the four figures can evoke the four tetramorphic zoa in Ezekiel 1, which Ezekiel 10 later calls cherubim, and the four zoa also of the book of Revelation's throne room vision. The seraphim and the cherubim seem to have undergone a certain conflation, similar to what is already at work in Revelation 4, where the zoa are full of eyes and tetramorphic, like the cherubim, but also, like the seraphim, intone the thrice holy hymn. This sort of cherubim-seraphim confusion, growing organically out of the assumption that despite their different and distinct spiritual abilities, all prophets have been gazing on the same divine manifestation and listened to the same heavenly liturgy. This is quite common in icons and manuscript illuminations depicting four seraphim, or combining the seraphic six wings with the cherubic wheels and eyes, or adding the inscription, Holy, 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 to representation of the cherubim, and so forth. The icon can be divided into registers. The upper register focuses on the figure on the throne. The lower register on the interaction between Isaiah and the cherub, or seraph. Now, who is this character, this angel? You remember that Anthony Cutler's description mentions an angel handing the burning coal to Isaiah on a spoon. Another researcher, Walter Christopher, speaks of Isaiah and the seraph. The editors of Treasures of Mount Athos mention seraph when summarizing the content of Isaiah 6, but then angel when they actually describe the image. Kurt Weitzman thinks it is an angel, but only because, he says, the illustrator apparently made the mistake of letting an angel instead of a seraph give the call to the prophet, whereas the hypothesized source of the illumination must have had the correct rendering. This is his phrase, the correct rendering of Isaiah receiving the call from a seraph. The biblical text speaks plainly about a seraph. One of the seraphim was sent to me, and he had in his hand a live coal, clearly one of the two seraphim described earlier in the vision. As a matter of fact, other illuminations, such as the 12th century Coquinobaphos Familiary from Vatican, or other depictions of the 12th century frescoes in Catalonia, show a winged seraph, not very anthropomorphic, unlike the anthropomorphic angel, or whatever this is here. A seraph with all the traits of a seraph, six wings and all of that, handing the call to Isaiah. In our image, however, as well as in this other one, Vaticanus Grecus 699, the seraph, who according to the biblical text interacts with Isaiah, has a very different appearance from the appearance of the seraph on the throne. See, from this seraph, he has morphed into something different, still winged, but with only two wings remaining, and rather more like the prophet, more anthropomorphic. Setting aside the plain wording of the biblical text in this case was not a random decision. It was certainly not theologically incorrect or mistaken. The notion of a seraph interacting directly with a human goes against the pseudo-Dionysian hierarchy. And whatever the putative Areopagitic disciple of the Apostle Paul had laid out in his celestial hierarchy and the ecclesiastical hierarchy, he had, by the end of the first millennium of the Common Era, long since become embedded in the religious and secular worldviews that Christians in the East and the West embodied. What we find in both of these images is a reflection of the Areopagitic view that humans only ever interact with their immediate superiors, the angels, those bodiless powers closest to us, who rank lowest among the celestials and are closest to us, barely concealed from human perception. Pseudo Dionysius, I should say, Dionysius the Areopagite, dedicates significant space to discussing the reason why the prophet Isaiah is said to have been purified by the seraphim. And that's a hierarchy 13. He presents two possible answers to this dilemma, both of which he ascribes to unnamed others. How is it possible that a text would say seraph when we know that the mediation of divine light, of divine presence, is imparted to us by the angels? According to the first explanation, the phrase "one of the seraphim" in Isaiah's vision is purely functional and refers to the fiery and purifying presence of a celestial agent who is nevertheless a mere angel. One of those angels assigned to us, Dionysius writes, one of those powers assigned to purify us. The second explanation, which Dionysius prefers, maintains the same view about the celestial agent who interacts with the prophet. This is, he writes, the vision revealed to the theologian came from one of those holy and blessed angels assigned to look after us. But it offers a more sophisticated explanation for the designation of this angel as seraph. In sum, the thesis is that what Isaiah receives does not originate with any created entity, but is the divine outpouring, the prodos of light, mediated by some heavenly entity. Second, that although the deifying vision and purification is mediated by a low-level spiritual entity, one of those holy and blessed angels assigned to look after us, the biblical reference to seraph is justified by the fact that, thirdly, what the angel passes on to the prophet, filtering, adapting it for the prophet's all-too-human receptive capacity, Isaiah's proximate angel had in turn received, filtered and adapted for his all-too-angelic receptive capacity from the superior rank of the archangels, who in turn had received it from their superiors, and so forth, ultimately from the highest rank of the bodiless powers, namely the seraphim. Briefly put, the angel was called seraph in a functional sense, because he sacredly worked out the purification of the theologian, writes Dionysius, in accordance with the general law of the hierarchy, which is that celestial beings attribute all their sacred activity done in imitation of God to the senior intelligent beings who live in conformity with God and who are the first ministers and teachers of the divine things. The artistic solution for this theologically difficult subject, which also occurs in this other manuscript, Illumination, you have in front of you, is to have a double depiction of the seraph. First, as a guardian of the divine throne, in solemn posture, with the 3 pairs of wings concealing much of the body. And then in the act of communing Isaiah with the living coal, having left behind 2 pairs of wings and the static, majestic appearance, and acquired human shape. During the interaction with the prophet, the anthropomorphism is evident. Then one of the seraphim was sent to me, and he had in his hand, enthechiri, in his hand he had a live coal that he had taken from the altar with the tongs. The anthropomorphism of the seraph, matching and meeting the humanity of the prophet, is an expression of the general philanthropia that characterizes the heavenly powers, those good and philanthropic angels, as Dionysius puts it in Epistle 8. The Illumination underscores this point by having the prophet and the angel form symmetrical figures, deferring to each other. Isaiah in a lilac imation and a blue tunic, and the angel in a blue imation and a lilac tunic. It should be noted, however, that the seraph simply imitates a condescension that was initiated earlier already by the enthroned Lord. although given that the visual exegesis of Isaiah 6 in this icon has already announced that the enthroned Lord is Jesus, true God and true man, the philanthropic seraph and his anthropomorphic condescension marks merely the halfway on the way, the halfway point of the visual reciprocal movements. That is, if the Lord is to descend and become truly flesh, so as to enable the ascent, the deifying ascent of humans, then this anthropomorphic angel is, as I said, the halfway mark. He announces, he approximates what is to happen, because he is both on the way to full humanity, but not quite. He's just anthropomorphic, and he represents, as a burning one, something of the proposed ascent. The prophet and the angel embody the Dionysian theme of reciprocal ecstasies, to use the phrase of my Dr. Vater. As the seraph retains his seraphic status, but condescends to a human shape that Isaiah is able to recognize and interact with, the prophet is caught up in a dynamic process of ascent into heaven, or ingression into the Holy of Holies, and transformation. The hot coal effects his accelerated ascent into the heavenlies, a spontaneous combustion into precisely a fiery one, a seraph, and then a sent one, an angel. Just as the anthropomorphism of the seraph is an expression of the general angelic philanthropia, pattern of Lord's philanthropic incarnation, the angelified prophet offers a fitting model for those whom Dionysius rightly calls in his exegesis of Isaiah 6, philangeli, friends or lovers, friends of angels, those who emulate the angelic life on the way to deification. This reciprocity and balance, however, is only apparent because the biblical text, as well as its visual exegesis, suggests that the anthropomorphic seraph and the angelified Isaiah are not simply meeting as equals in the topos and tropos defined by their reciprocal extension towards each other. Attentive readers, such as St. Ephrem of Nisibis and St. John Chrysostom, and attentive viewers of the icon, would notice, first, that the seraph carries the hot coal by means of tongues, whereas Isaiah receives it on his very lips. And second, that if the enthroned Lord is Jesus Christ, then Isaiah's purification by means of a fiery coal is a foreshadowing of the Eucharist. As a matter of fact, after the use of the liturgical spoon was gradually adopted in Byzantium, it seems that it started in the 7th century in Jerusalem. It's gradually caught on, and eventually, once it entered Constantinople, it was generalized. That liturgical implement, the liturgical spoon, was given the name lavis, tongues, so that the presbyter would enact first Isaiah's receiving of the living coal, and then apply to himself the words of Isaiah 6:7. Behold, this is touch my lips and shall purify all my sins, which the Illumination ascribes then to the seraph. To the prophet, the scroll that the prophet holds, and finally, the presbyter would act out the part of the seraph. When equipped with the tongues, with a liturgical spoon, that is, he dispenses the Eucharist to the congregants. The viewers are expected to identify it with the implement used for the Eucharistic communion and call it by its name, lavis, tongues, and understand that the entire scene is not so much about Isaiah, but about themselves. Let me just read these two beautiful texts here from St. Ephrem and St. John Chrysostom. The seraph did not touch the coal with his fingers. It touched only the mouth of Isaiah. The seraph did not hold it, and Isaiah did not eat it. But to us, our Lord has given both, a new marvel of our great Lord, for bodily ones, fire and spirit to eat and drink. And so there is a a gradual difference between the seraph, who has to use tongues, and Isaiah, who receives on his lips. But the fundamental difference is between both of these Old Testament characters, the seraph and the prophet, on the one hand, and the Christians on the other, who receive and eat and partake of fire and spirit of the risen body of Christ. And St. John Chrysostom, the seraphim did not dare touch it with their hands, but only with their tongues. But you take it into your hands. Since the viewers of the icon share with the prophet the same Lord, the same liturgy, the same divine condescension to elicit human assent, the human deifying assent, though for the Christian worshipper all these visionary realities have become flesh and blood, it is perhaps not far-fetched to say that the manuscript illumination under discussion is to some extent self-referential. The viewers see not only the prophet Isaiah, but themselves in the icon. Gazing in a Byzantine psalter upon the vision of Isaiah was a means for the worshippers who use the psalter to recognize their time and place as the communion of the saints, to acknowledge and renew their participation in the spiritual now of divine-human interaction, and to, as it were, reverse engineer the experience of Isaiah's transformative gaze. To conclude, then, the iconographic representation of Isaiah's vision in this 11th century Byzantine manuscript illumination encapsulates, I think, a fascinating exegesis. The details of the text in Isaiah 6 have been merged with elements drawn from two other significant theophanies, those of Ezekiel 1 and Daniel 7, and this entire cluster of theophanic passages was subjected to the Crystological exegesis typical of first millennium Christianity. In our case, the exegesis that remains normative. As a result, the Old Testament Lord, glory, Ancient of Days in the visions of Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel are explicitly identified with the Lord of Christian worship, Jesus. The dramatic encounter between the prophet and the seraph in the lower register of this image discloses a theological interest in the reciprocal ecstatic moves of divine condescension and human assent. Finally, the manuscript illumination allows us a glimpse into the performative aspect and experiential claims of early Christian exegesis, broadly construed so as to incorporate hymnography, iconography, and the ritual. It is in this kind of environment that the Hebrew Bible was re-envisioned and Christologically appropriated as Christian scriptures. Thank you for your patience. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Father Bogdan, you need to unmute yourself and switch on the microphone.
Hello. I apologize for having a recorded version of this, but I'm not feeling very well. I'm coughing a lot, and so this was a lot safer.
So if anyone have questions to Father Bogdan, please let us know. Maybe you could, people think they are unmuted, but if you switch on your microphone, you can speak. And also, I just wanted to ask how would you connect this image to nowadays perception of divine revelation?
Well, since we are the custodians of this kind of iconographic tradition, and since in the case of the Orthodox, there is no contradiction between the way we understand the vision of Isaiah in this iconographic medium and what our theology claims. I'm referring here to this Christophanic reading that Archbishop Alexander mentioned as being continuous here, and something different in the West. Since we have this tradition, it is always possible to use this image. I think if we look at this image as enabling the viewer to reverse engineer, as it were, the experience of the prophet, this is a way of plugging into a continuous tradition of experience, both individually. I remind you, this is an Psalter, so this would have been a book that one prayed with, both individually but also as a community, since these kinds of images occur also in churches and elsewhere. But I don't think there is a direct relevance to today, except if we enter in this manner into this tradition. I mean, it is a demanding tradition, but it pays off handsomely, I would say. I don't know if this answers your question.
Yeah. Okay, if anyone have questions, please do. I switch on to.
Excuse me.
Yes. On my part, there was a technical problem. I couldn't switch on my microphone. So, yes. Thank you very much for your reading the icon back to the text and text back to the icon, and also much of the tradition around it. It was a great demonstration of what the previous speaker was. You went into detail in this very idea of how the biblical tradition and the Jewish tradition and the early Christian tradition, how they are all connected. Thank you very much for that.
I wanted to add that you can replicate this kind of reading that I've applied to this particular icon of Isaiah's vision to iconography of Moses. That perhaps would have been closer to what the other presenters are doing, but I just hadn't worked it out. Or to other Theophanies. In other words, this is an example. This is not. This is nothing but an example.
Yes. And while perhaps many are thinking about your questions and what to ask, I would like to continue introducing you a little bit, because it might help us to discuss even this very lecture. Because your book,
yes.
Our listeners may not be familiar with your book, Scripture Envisioned, and I would, if you want to, well, I can give you a very brief introduction to that book, and then you can comment on that. Yes. So, Scripture Envisioned discusses the Crystological exegesis of biblical theophanies.
There you go.
Argues its crucial importance for the appropriation of the Hebrew Bible as the Christian Old Testament, the Emmaus episode in Luke 24, and its history of interpretation serve as the methodological and hermeneutical prologemonon to the early Christian exegesis of theophanies. Subsequent chapters discuss the reception history of Genesis 18, Exodus 3, and 33, Psalm 98, 99, and Psalm 131, 32. This is the Septuagint number alongside with the usual Hebrew numbering. Isaiah 6, Habakkuk 3 and 2, as it is in Septuaginta, Daniel 3 and 7. You are showing that the earliest, most widespread and enduring reading of these biblical texts, namely their interpretation as Christophanies, manifestations of the Logos to be incarnate, constitutes a robust and versatile exegetical tradition which lent itself to doctrinal reflection, apologetic polemics, liturgical anamnesis, and doxology.
I agree completely, as you can imagine. There is a question here that says, can you say a little more about how it works out with Moses? What I meant was that if we had shown, instead of the vision of Isaiah, an image of the burning bush, for instance, which in many manuscript illuminations, especially in the Christian West, in fact, shows Moses taking off his sandals before some depiction of a tree or a bush or something like this engulfed in flames, on top of which, or in the midst of which, you have a figure of Christ. I could have done the same basic reading. That is, I could have noted the same Crystological identification of Moses' interlocutor in this case, pointed to the fact that there is rich precedent in patristic interpretation for this representation, mapped out where it shows up and for how long, when it goes away, and then pointed to the performative script, the script for a performance of an experience that this icon constitutes. In other words, it's never about only the protagonists in the icons. I mean, the point of venerating an icon is to be shaped according to the pattern laid out in the icon, and to become a better worshipper, to be shaped into a worshipper like Moses or like Isaiah. There's a long way, but the point is, because we share the same object of veneration, as it were, that's why I said the same Lord, the same liturgy, the same medium in which we become contemporaries with Isaiah or Moses or Ezekiel or Habakkuk or etc. So that's what I meant by the fact that we could have had Moses instead of Isaiah.
Great, thank you very much, Father. Very helpful.
Excuse me.
Yes, thank you very much, and please just come in with your questions. I have a question about, this is to be a first book in the series of 3, and I'm fascinated. Are there really so many Theophanies that it's enough for a series of 3?
No, but now that I've moved from having to pretend that I'm a biblical scholar, which is what I did, faking it for 13 years at Duquesne University, since the position was for Bible, to St. Vladimir's seminary, where I don't have to pretend that I'm anything but a student of the fathers, and so doing patristics. Now I can write about the same cluster of theophanic texts, but from a different perspective, from a historical point of view, to narrate, as it were, what I see as the occurrence of these of the exegesis of Theophanies in early Christianity, in various polemical or doxological or catechetical context, in various contexts along the centuries, from the New Testament itself to as long as it makes sense to talk about it. Certainly, as we've heard from Archbishop Alexander, certainly up to St. Gregory Palamas, and there is no reason to stop with St. Gregory Palamas, because this is an element of continuity in Orthodox Christianity. I think it is important to underline the fact that we don't suffer from the contradiction between the traditional way of depicting theophanies and the way in which Theophanies are understood by, let's say, professional theologians. Whereas in the Christian West, I find it still remarkable that in the 12th and 13th century, you can find depictions of Moses interacting with Jesus, even though this is what is painted, since this is a conservative skill, I mean, a conservative art. You paint as has always been painted, at least until the Renaissance. There is no major change in the way manuscript illuminations are done, or icons or statues. But the theology has changed. With the growth of Augustine, with the stature of Augustine gradually increasing its size and his influence being so overwhelming, his reading of Theophanies imposed itself too. And that creates a certain tension between what Augustine says Theophanies are and are not, and what the iconographic tradition affirms. And it ends badly for the icons. The icons eventually go away. We don't have this problem in the East, but we have the greater problem, I think, of not being aware of what we have. So I hope to some extent that these kinds of revisiting, this mode of revisiting traditions that for which we are, even though we're unworthy custodians, that we are remembering these things and do this also for the sake of all other Christians. If we have maintained this tradition, then we ought to know it and we ought to share it. It is, after all, the shared tradition of ancient Christianity, and it is shared with everyone who comes from this tradition, which is anyone who wants to be attached to that tradition.
Yes, yes, it's empowering somehow, because we are rediscovering the whole vision, and not just not limiting ourselves.
With the note that the icon is given, or this understanding, the sketch is given for life, not only for scholarly description. In other words, if we read this icon the way it was meant to be read, if we identify, or if we become like the ideal audience of the iconographer, then this aesthetic object is given to us as a help for worship, as a guide in spiritual life. And in this sense, it is for life. It is not only for scholarly appreciation. It's easy in a way. It's a great pleasure, and in a way convenient and joyful to do this kind of work. The hard part becomes, once you understand what this is for and how it is to be used, to actually engage in it. That's the second part, and for this one does not get grades or tenure or all the other things. I don't know if I make myself understood. I'm being elusive and perhaps needlessly complicated here.
No, I think what you have said is kind of, it shows that it's not complicated actually, and it helps us to interpret without thinking that this is complicated. It's just that we sometimes miss things. But I would like to ask if there's anything more from the audience. You may come and put on your microphone and ask and make a commentary. We have the Archbishop is still with us, and we could have questions to both of you. And if not, I have one question. I was thinking that we have discussed theophanies and this wonderful example of a theophany, and you even touched the theophany of the burning bush in these terms, and there are many others. But in this Second Temple Jewish heritage, there must be many other strains, so to say, and I was thinking about two things, both anthropology and perhaps even this very fundamental thinking in our Orthodox or the ascetic tradition about purification, illumination, and deification. Are there what do we have in the Second Temple tradition apart from what we have discussed this far that comes very close to the continuation, both in the area of anthropology and this kind of idea of spirituality? It's a large question, but you may both make a comment.
I think Vedic Alexander is certainly far more on topic here to speak about the Desert Fathers and their luminosity and their recuperating something.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, we can't see you though.
Oh dear.
Yes.
There we are. First of all, the anthropology. I think I mentioned in my talk, but it doesn't hurt to underline it. That our anthropology, our Christian anthropology, our Orthodox Christian anthropology, is already implicit in Genesis 1:26, in the notion of image and likeness, especially image, although likeness, because this word, and that's because of a linguistic thing. Dumut, the Hebrew for likeness, occurs both in Genesis 1:26 and in Ezekiel 1:26 and 1:28. In 1:26, talking about the figure on top in the throne carried by the cherubim, he says it was, as it were, the appearance of the likeness of a human being. And then 2 verses later, 1:28, he says, as it was, as it were, the appearance of the glory of God. Now, the significance is in the pairing or apposition, if you will, of likeness and glory. Back to the notion of that Bogdan touched on just now, or rather in his talk, that the enthroned anthropos of the icon discussed is in fact the template, the model for the human being. As Irenaeus puts it in, those are the apostolic teaching, something like that. When God, the Father, forms the human being, he looks at his Son. And again, it is the Son, the second person, who appears. The consistent pre-Nicene exegesis, which, as Bogdan noted, continues especially in the hymnography of the Church. It is the second person, thus, who is, and Justin Martyr actually specifies this explicitly, who is the glory. Well, glory and likeness, as not synonymous precisely, but the one implying the other, thus applied to the human being from the start, from the very beginning, not only assumes, but insists on the possibility of deification. And this continues. There are lots of instances in the Jewish tradition of the transfiguration, if you will, of at least the heroes of the apocalypses, starting with Enoch in First Enoch. He is, after all, he not only ascends to heaven and comes before the throne of God, but he's assigned an archangelic function, namely to read the riot act to the fallen angels below. And this is underlined in Second Enoch, Slavonic Enoch, and then elaborated on in a long passage on transformation in the rabbinic era Third Enoch, or Sefer Hekalot, the book of the heavens. And Jewish scholars have touched on this, on the transformation of the righteous into light. The title of one article I remember reading. So the anthropology is there, as is the soteriology. What was the other? You had one other.
Yeah,
part.
The other question is related because it's the movement from purification through illumination to transfiguration.
Now, Exegesis, there's a wonderful article by a Jewish scholar named Stephen Frade, 2 A's. I think he teaches at Yale, wasn't he? In a collection on early Jewish mysticism, put out by Crossroads Press, when he speaks about the implied ascesis in the apocalyptic literature of the seers. Daniel's a vegetarian, right? You have prostrations, like monastery. And moreover, the portrayal of the biblical prophets in a lovely, I think it's 1st century Jewish work called The Lives of the Prophets. They are almost all ascetics. In Daniel, it's so prominent that one Jewish scholar tried to maintain this as a 4th century Byzantine work inspired by the monasteries, but another German came along and said, nope, it's decidedly earlier. So that's all there. And of course, the monks themselves, if you see in the life of Pachomius, who is he assimilated to? He's assimilated to Moses and to the other seers of the scriptures. The prophet. So there's continuity there too.
Yes, and it's even obvious when you're reading the Synaxarion, daily lives of the saints, and the very many of the early martyrs and saints, it's being told of them that they withdrew to the desert or the loneliness or fasting, and so on. Yes,
it's in the that's in the Ascension of Isaiah that Bogdan mentioned, early 2nd century.
Think also of the fact that we have more immediate access, auditory access to the services that we all share. Everyone is buried at some point, and everybody will be there for someone dear's burial service. And one of the hymns that we hear, and I recall this from my childhood as a hymn that impressed me very, very much and made this service my favorite church service, from the Necrosima Eulogitaria, from the funeral hymns that we sing. One of these hymns says, I am the image, the icon of your unutterable glory, even though I bear the scars of my stumblings. And if you flip it, even though I do bear the scars of many stumblings, I am ikon tis aritodoxis su, the image of the glory. Given what this is much stronger, in fact, than Genesis 1:26, because it doesn't say according to the image. It says, I am the image. And the prototype of the image that I am is the glory. If we recall everything that has been said about Ezekiel and the anthropomorphic glory, as read by Christians, then you have all the pieces of this puzzle and the beautiful paradox that I am dust, right? That's what we read. I am dust, but I'm also the image of this glory, with everything that the image of glory, everything that we imagine and everything that we cannot even imagine, that God wishes for this image of divine glory. So as a very exalted and optimistic anthropology, I think this is perhaps a good entry point into catechetical, even missionary presentation of this ancient tradition. I think it's more convincing to hear that even though you are bloody from top to bottom and bear the scars of your stumblings, you are nonetheless the image of divine glory and called therefore to function as such, as a living statue of God. Then to be told, first of all, you've got to start with you are utterly depraved, you are broken beyond fixing, and so forth. Just my personal jab at a theology that I could never really embrace. I'm sorry.
Yes, in living statue, you said, but perhaps better put, we're called to each to be Theophanies. The human being is called to be Theophany. Yes.
So maybe if these images that I've presented and the hymns that we know and so forth, if all of these can be, I mean, they ought to be connected with this statement from the funeral service. You know, they become more directly relevant. It's a very strong statement, and you can connect back this affirmation of the funeral service to the ascetical tradition. I have in mind, Radhika, this text that you like very much about Ava Pamvo, who shines with great glory, with great light, not randomly, but because he shines like Moses. And Moses does not shine randomly either, neither he nor Pamvo, because both of them are regaining the image of Adam's glory. In other words, the growth in becoming truly human and becoming deified as such is recuperating something. It is not we're not inventing anything. It is something that God has already envisaged for us, something that could have been and should have been, but by our creative getting in the way, has not yet come to be, but remains open for anybody who is willing to. I'm sorry, I can't speak straight. Just noodles.
I don't know if the audience or Olga has a question. I still have one.
Are there any continuation between the idea of image and likeness within Jewish tradition and in Christian tradition? Because in Jewish tradition, as far as I understand, this phrase "image and likeness" doesn't have a huge meaning, and our human being, if we read Genesis 2:7, is nothing more as nefesh or neshama, so the flesh filled with divine spirit. And is it or ruach or neshama in other places? Are there any continuation between the traditions, or is it a Christian understanding of being an image and likeness is different from the Jewish, or if the Jewish understanding exists?
Well, it exists certainly in the ancient literature, and in the possibility of, or the call to transfiguration, they have that same notion. After all, we were talking about the linking of glory and image, the divine glory and image is there in the Hebrew scriptures. It's not something that we Christians bring to the table. We continue it. As I said in my talk, Christ completes this. But he doesn't start it. He completes it. This was the intention from the start. And this is received in Jewish tradition, at least, as I said, in the ancient text and a number of the ancient rabbis. Jewish tradition has many strands. And contemporary Judaism, I am following Father Silvio Bunte here, another one of my former students, from whom I, as I do from all of them, learn. A long, powerful current in Jewish tradition is influenced by Moses Maimonides, who sort of does what to the Jewish theophanic tradition what Augustine did to the Christian. So they have different schools and takes. I am citing, though, the work of Jewish scholars on the early Jewish tradition and insisting on deification as part of the what we call deification, part of the composite. Start.
Oh, something happened here.
I'm trying to show something, but I don't know if it really works.
Yeah, it works very well.
Yes.
Here, okay. So this is the text that I mentioned earlier. Archbishop Alexander's, or one of Archbishop Alexander's very beloved texts. Just as Moses received the image of Adam's glory when his face is glorified, so also did Abba Pamvo's face shine like lightning. And this is by no means an exception. The point of Abba Siluan and Abba Sisois, partaking of the same work, is to say this is the norm. This is not, ought to be the norm. This is not an exception, an aberration. This idea with Adam's glory, this is certainly not a Christian invention. It's something where we can posit continuity. The very notion of Adam's glory and the notion of an exalted Adam finds its most extravagant expressions. That is an Adam of cosmic size and so forth, not in Christian but in Jewish literature. And the notion of luminosity, even the fact that there's an entire discussion about whether luminosity luminosity is something that Adam had or was given later to Adam. This is something that it seems that Christians and Jews debate, but polemics assume that you know what you're disagreeing about. That there is, in other words, some common ground for disagreement or for agreement, for that matter. And of course, here is the strong statement about humans being the icon, the image, the statue of God's unspeakable glory. Well, this is not uniquely Christian. As a matter of fact, if this hymn is probably something like a 6th, 7th century creation that came to be a part of this entire group of set of texts later on, I think by the 10th century they circulated as a group. But the theology, I think, is pretty old. Let me show you one that you will like very much. Well, this is from Qumran. The glory of Adam, and Adam fashioned in the likeness of God's glory. I think it's using very similar kind of language. This doesn't mean that there is a literary connection. That would be impossible to prove, or very difficult and unnecessary, because it's not literary connections that work best, but a mindset, a mode of worship, sensitivity for a specific kind of spiritual life. This is the soup, I think, in which these images are combined and recombined, and building blocks that are very ancient and predate Christianity come to be articulated as something Christian. Here is the Christian articulation of the same, but what I mentioned earlier from Leviticus Rabbah, if I'm not mistaken, that's something like 5th century. The apple of Adam's heel outshining the globe of the sun, and the face is brighter than that, of course. Well, this is not something that rabbis have made up. This is not something that rabbis have taken from the fathers of the church. This is something that both the fathers and the rabbis articulate in a specific way, in a distinct way, and sometimes in mutual polemics, but out of building blocks that predate both, and that point to a common pool of images and concerns.
I have a question that relates to this, the Jewish tradition having different directions and schools. Because when I was reading Stephen the Young's book, Religion of the Apostles, Father Bogdan, I think there's some kind of noise behind your microphone. So maybe...
Let me mute myself then.
Yes, you did something good now. Thank you.
I don't know what I did, but
yes. Well, yes, and I had this impression. There was this he was showing that from Second Temple onwards, there were very strong traditions about the Son, the Word of God, or the Son of God, or the Son of God's face, and I had the impression that this is so close that the only thing that is needed is now to give this Son a name, and then suddenly we have the Son of God, and it's such a the impression was that it was such a evident tradition that it's obviously Christological. It prefigures the gospel. But at the same time, when we are reading the Gospels, there is this very strong opposition between the Pharisees and the Lord debating, and we have this opposition even in the writings of Saint Paul, for example, in First Thessalonians, where he is very explicit about the Jews rejecting the whole Christian message and the Son of God. I would like you to comment on that, because there seems to be different strands, and there seems to be this very pious Jewish tradition that is prefiguring Christianity, but at the same time this opposition that is so obvious.
Well, but I think Jewish tradition is rich, multifaceted, and something in its own right, without the need to prefigure Christianity, and still speak in ways that we can understand. And we can be considered, from a rabbinic point of view, a complete misunderstanding of everything sacred, and still be understood for what we mean. It's not always the case. In my paper, I mentioned this discussion about whether in Daniel you have one or two or several powers. because you have mention of at least two things, the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man, and how the rabbis are concerned to show that these are not two lords, two powers, two gods. And some suppose that there is nobody who would affirm such a thing except Christians. All right, so this would be an accurate reading of the Christianity, say, of the Gospels, where very clearly the Son of Man is over the designation for Christ. And when at the end of Matthew, authority has been given to him on earth as in heaven and so forth, this sounds pretty much like the giving of universal and eternal authority to the Son of Man in Daniel 7. But this is a polemic that does not really, that completely misses the point of Revelation 1, where the two characters are seen as two aspects, two modes of speaking about the same Christ. And so my point is, you have biblical imagery, you have the concern of affirming the oneness of the Lord, and you have some unclear adversary that speaks about two. But in some instances, Christians and rabbis find themselves, probably unwittingly, on the same side of the barricade, because as you've seen, Romanos says, one Lord, the same one Lord who is both the Son of Man and the Ancient of Days, and the rabbis are saying the precisely same thing, and the difference is in naming this one Lord. It's true that Christians are making the scandalous claim that this one Lord is Jesus of Nazareth, but as you might know, in some strands of today's Judaism, in Hasidic Judaism, in the among the followers of Rabbi Schneerson, who died in, I think, 1994, after having rumored to be the Messiah, within that group, a new leader has not been chosen, because that would be going back on the notion that Schneerson was the Messiah. And from the same elements, from the same scriptural elements, you see reconstituting themselves things that are very familiar. For instance, there's an offshoot of that group led by a Moldovan rabbi. There is a rabbi from today's Republic of Moldova who lives in, I think, Portland, of all places, and who says everybody knows that the Rebbe was the Messiah. I mean, that's a given. But what very few understand is that he's more than that. What is he? He is the Lord himself. And you wonder, well, okay, you can see the same kind of DNA giving birth to very similar formations. There is something that that combines the building blocks in very much the same ways. I find this fascinating that we have heresies that are labeled sometimes abusively, but sometimes with some accuracy as being Judaizing or Jewish, modalistic kinds of theologies, or strictly subordinationist one, or philanthropic Christologies. This is all Jewish stuff, Jewish. And the point is not that Jews are necessarily interested in defining Christ in any way. The point is, this is a kind of Christianity that gets it wrong because it combines the elements in the wrong way, because it starts with the wrong premise. And similarly, this group that I mentioned is being accused of being crypto-Christian, which goes to show that there is indeed a kinship that is very hard to deny, but very hard to define also. I'm happy to leave things floating like this in to a great extent because I don't know very much about this, but I'm fascinated by it. I think this is something that allows us to talk to each other in a way that is productive for our respective traditions. And what Archbishop Alexander has started with this Theophania school is the kind of articulation of Orthodox theology that is most apt to enter into a theological dialogue with the Jewish, with the rabbinic, today's Jewish tradition. Not that we would necessarily come to an agreement, but that we would understand what we mean. I think this is a great and important thing.
Thank you very much, Father Bucknan. This is very illuminating. Vladika, would you like to comment on what?
No, I don't think I have anything to add.
Okay.
He said it quite well. A common DNA, yes?
Yes, a sort of, I don't know. I forgot in biology what the process was, the difference between meiosis and mitosis. But the process by which you have one cell that divides into two cells that replicate the same material from the mother cell. I think this is a good way of thinking about church and synagogue. And as much as we can criticize each other, and as much as we've been abusing each other, the synagogue first for a century, and then Christians for the remaining 19 or maybe 18, we do share a lot more than we perhaps understand. If we are to ascribe the syntax, the designation separated brethren, I think this would be something to think about. Can we call the synagogue our separated brethren? Of course, this might be more for the sake of scandalizing people, but getting people to think than for anything else. But if you pose a problem in this way, we have a chance of engaging in more productive discussion.
And the impression you both have been giving this afternoon is also that the early fathers, the hymnology and liturgy has made a much better reading that I was just describing. The kind of reading you read the Gospels and you see an opposition from the Jews. That's one reading, and it's a very simplistic reading. But the tradition seems to have made, in the long run, a much better reading. That is at least what I get from both of you.
But in the scriptures themselves, what is Nicodemus if not a very learned Jewish teacher, a Pharisee, right? And why is he going to see Jesus by night? What does he want? It's a very interesting dialogue that we have in the Gospel of John in chapter 3. It's a dialogue which basically eliminates all the questions and only gives you the answers. But on the basis of Jesus' answers, you can reconstruct what Nicodemus's concerns were. And it's very clear that if you were to insert then the questions on the basis of the answers of Jesus, Nicodemus comes to ask how one is to ascend to heaven, how one is to enter the kingdom of heaven, how one is to see what's there in the kingdom of heaven. And this is a pretty good discussion, a pretty good description of the concerns of an apocalyptic seer or a wannabe apocalyptic seer, to which the Gospel of John gives a series of responses that do not deny in its substance the concern, that it's a good concern, that such a thing exists, that it ought to be done, etc., but corrects the mode of beginning, how one should begin to do such a thing. And the same later on with Saint Ignatius of Antioch, who says, I know about the rankings of angels and heavenly realities. Of course I do, he says, but I'm not going to tell you, because it might do you a lot more harm. So this apocalyptic heritage doesn't have to be 100% correct, orthodox, but it's a treasury of realities and of images that the church has interpreted in a certain way and used a certain way and recentered on the figure of Christ, on the passion and resurrection of Christ. And so in some ways it is very different, but it is a construction using the same means. And the opposition is not so much on issues of substance, but on issues of, not so much the glossary, as it were, but the syntax, how to put together the words in a meaningful theological statement, using the syntax as a metaphor here.
Yes. And thank you also very briefly. Thank you for reminding that the Jews in the Gospels are not just the Pharisees or the Sadducees or the high priest, but they also Nicodemus and the disciples, the people. So,
and there is one Jesus who used to go to synagogue, right? St. Luke says went to synagogue as was his custom. Sometimes we forget.
yes.
Whose circumcision we celebrate.
Yes.
We have one of the feasts of the Lord, right? The circumcision of the Lord. I don't know how many Orthodox Christians are actually fully aware of what they're celebrating on the 1st of January, but yeah.
Thank you. We have lots of people joining us, and I'm sure I know that some of them are specialists in these issues. Do you, if you want to ask a question, to make a comment, please unmute yourself and unmute your camera and do, because very soon we need to have a coffee break, because at 5 o'clock we are going to have Vespers. So please feel free to unmute yourself and if you have comments. Or if not, we maybe Johannes, maybe we need to have a short break, 15 minutes for before we have Vespers. Because we had so long presentations. And
yes, but thank you for your wonderful contributions, and also during all the answers and insights that you've shared.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much, Vladika, also for giving the opening talk.
I'm glad to have been here. It's been fun. Oh, God bless you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. It was a blessing to have you with us today.
And for me to be here.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
So please, we need to stop now because we need to have a short break, 15 minutes before we have Vespers. But if you still want to join and make comment, please do now.
Hello?
Hello?
Yes, just to mention that during the feast of the angels recently, His Holiness Patriarch Daniel, he presented a very interesting paper about the angels, relying on the Bible and on the patristic tradition. And also, so if you go to the website of the Patriarchate of Romania, you can read the text in English, and it's very interesting because I think Johannes mentioned earlier a relation also of the liturgical language, how we make many reference to the angels, and he's going back to the Torah, and then he comes to the Christian tradition, and then he comes today to mention about the prayers we have for every angel, and he started from the angel, the meeting of the angel and the Agar, when Agar was rejected by her husband. God was with her to guide her, according to the Genesis. Just to remind you about this important speech of the Patriarch Daniel, who expressed somehow the Orthodox tradition about our relation with the angelic powers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Eminence. Could you just briefly repeat the name of the article so we can find it?
If you go to the website of the Romanian Patriarchate, on 8th of November, the Patriarch Daniel, he presented a paper about, from the Orthodox point of view, about our relation with the angels. He mentioned, he summarized somehow all the important points you mentioned now in your introduction, and then he relates our personal prayers on angel, that all of us, we have our personal angel. But he's going back to the Jewish tradition, he comes to the Christian tradition, and he used all important reference in this direction, and especially what also our brother mentioned about the glory and His Eminence about glory and the angels.
Oh, thank you very much. I think we can find it.
In this way, we have a revelation of God in the contemporary world, somehow, through this analysis. Thanks.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much, Your Eminence.
Olga, can you hear me?
Yes, and you, Father Stephen, you could switch on your camera. So please do.
All right. I will do that. Thank you so much. This was such a wonderful beginning. It was really very good. And I cannot thank you enough for inviting the people who came to speak and for making it such a successful first day. I have a suggestion for tomorrow afternoon. In order to stay on schedule as the moderator, as the discussant, I'd like to ask each speaker to present themselves instead of my giving a resume, because I do not know exactly how their theological and personal background will relate to their papers. So what I would like to do, rather than present each speaker, just invite them to present themselves succinctly, which will allow us to stay on schedule. Would you agree to that? Is that all right?
Yeah, I hope so.
You can repeat that when you start tomorrow. I'm
Sorry?
I'm sure you can repeat that also when you start tomorrow, because
Yes, of course, I would do that. Thank you so much. I'm going to run off to Vespers in my church. I apologize. Thank you again. It was a wonderful first day. It really was wonderful.
yes,
Goodbye.
Yeah.
Good
I
night.
need to go to my choir practice, so I'm sorry for leaving you for tonight.
Yes, sure.
Okay.
But you do have, for those, just a small comment for those who will attend the Vespers. So you have the text on our webpage, and I have also emailed it to you. All right. So see you very soon. So have a very good tea.